All right. I think Dambisa, we're going to get started. We'll have more participants joining, but in the interest of making sure we take every moment of time we have from you and take all we can from it, we're going to get going. So, welcome everyone to this board list event, which I'm super excited to be moderating with Dr. Dambisa Moyo. Who just yesterday launched her book, How Boards Work. And as many of you know, graciously provided 400 copies to our community ahead of launch, which let me just say thank you again for so graciously providing some copies for our community. I know we had so much demand that they disappeared, but for all the rest, hopefully you have an opportunity to hear from Dambisa today personally and decide if the book is something you would like to go pick up as well. So look, Dambisa, you and I did not know each other, which was quite a surprise because as usual, when we got on the phone together, maybe several weeks ago, and you explained what you were doing, I was like, how could it be that that I haven't heard of you earlier, given how tremendous your background is? So for those of you who don't know Dambisa, I mean, she is, first of all, a very renowned author. This is your fourth book. Fifth book, 4 previous New York Times bestsellers. So apologies, I already got that wrong. But a pretty esteemed board member, currently on the boards of both Chevron and 3M, but previously on the boards of Seagate, Barrick Gold, SAB Miller, Barclays. So really a pretty phenomenal kind of board resume, and we're excited to get into that. But prior to that, of course, spent the bulk of your career at Goldman Sachs and the World Bank as an economist. And so just a tremendous background, and we're excited to chat with you.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here, and I very much look forward to a lot of interaction and questions.
Yeah. So, and for the audience, anybody who knows me knows it's pretty hard for me to go long without turning to QA. So what we're going to do is I'm going to kick us off here with a few questions, and pretty quickly this session will become interactive and I will go to QA and moderate. So feel free to start loading up your questions so that Dambisa has the opportunity really to interact with you even more than me. So Dambisa, when you and I brainstormed like what of the many board topics we could talk about on this session, one thing that fascinated me and where I thought we could start before we talk about the advice in the book is really your personal board journey. Because when I watch what happens on the board list and off of our platform, one of the things I observe is there's still a fairly big divide in what boardrooms want. There is this archetypical boardroom profile, which is large P&L experience. You know, how many thousands of people have you managed? Have you been a CEO? And we do see demand that I would call quite traditional in terms of the expectations. But then I see that many thought leaders, influencers, people who are high experts in their field, as you are, but don't have that traditional background, make it into the boardroom. But I think there's a lot of mystery onto how that second path happens. And so I had said to you, are you comfortable talking about that? Because that I thought would be a great place to anchor a conversation. So to start with, tell us about how you got on your first board, particularly given your non-traditional background.
Yes. So, first of all, I just want to be absolutely clear that I am what I call an unconventional board member. I did not come from the C-suite. 12 years ago, when I joined my first large global complex board, I had no C-suite experience. And in addition, I lack woman from Africa. And so I should also say, just to put this in context, I had spent a good half decade trying to get on boards. I had sent in my resume, got the door slammed in front of me. And honestly, whereas today there seems to be a lot more information about what companies are looking for, I mean, 12 years ago, it was really, sort of groping around in the dark. Nobody had the sort of temerity or decency to say, hey, Dambisa, no, you can't join our board. And by the way, here's why we don't want you, kind of thing. You just kind of were like, well, I have no idea what's going on here. I'm sure we'll come back to that, particularly where women candidates are concerned. But in any case, I really did luck out. I think it is true that board search firms matter, and having some contacts to the board search industry is an important piece. And obviously, I do, as you rightly point out, I think if you come from the C-suite in particular, there's a little bit of an easier path. I always say, who doesn't want to be on the board of Amazon? Everybody does. And when I was like, oh, I'd like to be on the board of Amazon, and I saw they hired Indra Nooyi. I'm like, okay, wait a second. Indra Nooyi deserves to be on the board of Amazon. So, he's somebody with C-suite experience and, has dealt with complex problems in a very challenged environment, is obviously going to be very appealing. But for me, the third piece is critical, the network. That's how I got on boards. I mean, just to be absolutely clear, my network really rallied, but I also have to say I greatly benefited without a big agenda a priori from writing my first book. That definitely set me aside from the pack. I had a message in there that was appealing to the boards that I joined immediately after I joined the board of SAB Miller, the beer, actually really drinks company. And I also joined the boards of Barclays. Both of them had enormous emerging market footprints. They were very interested in a more constructive dialogue on how they could contribute to economic growth. So I kind of just, I happen to know people on the board, and I didn't actually lobby them. When the book came out, they're like, oh, actually, we saw your book. We thought it was interesting. Would you be interested in joining the board? I'm like, where have you been for the past 7 years? I've been trying to get on board. So that, I have no doubt about it that helped a lot. But if I may, just before I pass it back to you, Sukhinder, it's probably worth just saying a couple of things about board structures. So many of you will know the numbers really vary, but fundamentally for large global public company board, we're talking about 12 people. I think that's the number that people think is the ideal number. It's big enough that it satiates or satisfies the committee requirements underneath, and we can talk about committees later if you wish. But at the same time, it's small enough that it is intimacy. There's the sort of ability to have very constructive conversations, even if sometimes challenged, in a smaller team environment. And so that's a great numbers as a trade-off. And I think the rule of thumb now is about at least 40% of the board should have come from the C-suite. And it's not sort of set in stone, but I think that's kind of how people think about it in the boardroom. There's definitely an acknowledgement that we need people who have got varied backgrounds. I mean, look at the world we're in right now. Issues of global economics and geopolitics and science and pandemics matter. And so having those different voices from academia or other paths is important, ESG, of course. But at the same time, one of my favorite questions that somebody told me a number of years ago is that, when people are applying to boards, they never ask the question, who's going to call me from management? And that's a really important question in terms of how we approach ourselves or try to get on boards. You need to ask yourself, who's going to call me? Is it going to be the CEO? Is it going to be the CFO if I'm very strong in the sort of financial side? Is it going to be the CISO, the person who's involved more on the sort of cyber and the technology structures? Like, who's going to call you? And I think that's a fantastic question, because my view is that if you're on a board and nobody's calling you from the management team or from the company, that's a pretty bad situation. Sorry about that. It's a pretty bad situation to be in. So that's what I would say.
Well, interestingly, you've given me 3 separate threads here that I want to pick up on, and we're going to go to those 3 threads, and then we're going to take our very first question. So you said 3 things that I think are pretty critical to think about this non-traditional path into the boardroom. Number 1, you brought up very quickly thought leadership. You were like, look, I was looking for 6 or 7 years, and then I write a book that happens to trigger on a domain.
Sukhinder?
Yes, sorry. Can you hear me? Hello. I want to make sure folks can hear me. Let's see how we go here. Dambisa, can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Yeah, you froze there for a moment. Sorry.
Welcome to Zoom. All right. What I was saying was you hit on one big topic, which is thought leadership, right? And interestingly, you already linked it to the management team. So one vector I want to pick up on here is thought leadership. And on what are you a thought leader? That is actually a seminal question, particularly if it's a seminal question if you're a C-suite candidate. It's even more seminal if you are not a traditional C-suite. So that's one. Number 2, you hit on networks, and I want to hit on that. And number 3, you hit on something that people don't often talk about, which is which boards have the room to take you, which is which boards have the room in their structure to have, let's call it specialization. And you kind of hit on that too. So I want to come all the way back to those 3 topics. And then I promise Jenny will take your first question, which I already see posted on the board. So let's talk about thought leadership. You said, if you don't know who at the company is going to call you, that's a problem. Let's turn that around and say, is it possible to get a board without being a thought leader or domain expert on some seminal topic?
And so here you're specifically talking about people who are not coming from the C-suite.
Yes, not talking coming from the C-suite. So let's presume that the C-suite path is a different path, but I want to go deeper here. Yes. I still challenge C-suite members, by the way. What are you a thought leader on? Right. But like put another way, I guess my hypothesis to you is it's really, unless you can identify what you're the thought leader on and which management team member, including the CEO, would call you for expertise, it's very hard to imagine yourself in the boardroom. Is that true?
I would say that is true. I use a rule of thumb my mother always told me, which is you need to be a butcher, a baker, or a candlestick maker. And I think that's very true. If you cannot identify what skill you're bringing to the boardroom, and it's a really important point, because ultimately, if you say to me, well, Dambisa, what's the most important skill in the boardroom? I would say judgment, but that's not how we initially vet who's coming to the board. You need to be able to contribute, or to be seen to contribute to a lot of complex issues where there aren't any answers. But also, if you remember a moment ago, I mentioned we've got committees. Yes. We have audit committees, we've got remuneration, the compensation committees, we've got the nominations and governance committee, risk committees. Those committees need to be staffed by board members. And so having expertise in some area that's very clearly defined, I think is critically important. Now, the reason I think this is an interesting conversation is because everyone who knows me knows that I am jack of all trades, master of none. And in some respects, it's almost harder to think about where you can add value if you do what I've done, which has had quite a plural career. Even when I was at Goldman Sachs, I was there almost 10 years, but I had, worked on their interest rates desk, worked in the economics arena. And those are areas that are really interesting to me. But I think that the more that as part of the network, you're seen as somebody who is not dogmatic about views, you're pragmatic, you understand that corporations are very complex beings, and you show good judgment in whatever sphere you're being judged on. I think that is something people find very appealing, and people kind of want to like you. They don't want to work with naysayers. I had to learn this because, as an economist, I think a lot of economists tend to be very glass half empty. Oh gosh, there's digitization, there's debt, there's a whole list of reasons that the world is coming to an end. But you can't do that if you're running a business. You can't shrink yourself to growth. And so even in the most dire circumstances, you're constantly trying to figure out where's the opportunity, where's the upside. And I think having that constructive lens to your thought leadership and whatever you're doing is important. And I'm going to say one last thing, then I'm going to shut up. I think it also really depends on where you are on the board. So my first boards were in the United Kingdom. And in Britain, although there's a lot of overlap in different companies, and ultimately companies have board members have a custodial role, they have a fiduciary duty, there are differences at the margin. But one of the things that I think is quite stark and stands out in the British context is there is a little bit more of what I call a check and challenge approach, a little bit more, hey, the CEO is not my friend. I'm here to kind of make sure you're doing the right thing. So in that respect, you find that there are a lot more people who are lawyers, auditors, accountants who end up on boards in Britain. Whereas in the United States, I think there's a bit more of a sense that the CEO needs a place to go, a safe place to go where he or she can say, gosh, goodness me, I did not expect this COVID thing. Help me, I need advice. What should I be thinking about, in a way without they're, worried that they're going to be judged or criticized. And so in that respect, I think it's a little bit more collegial, a little bit more cooperative in the US context.
Well, you keep giving me gems here that I want to pick up on, even if they're not, the same. I think you're making two other important points. Number one, in a non-traditional path, your first point of entry may be an international board. I have definitely seen folks inside the boardless community and otherwise who are like, I don't want to travel. I don't want, and once you start to limit yourself on your first board, that may limit your opportunity. Size obviously limits it. We talked about that. And size is an opportunity in public boards. And I would say in boards that have the room for specialization. Number two, international boards. And I think you're speaking specifically to the European context. Often the chairman is not the CEO of the board. They are very structured in their nomination and governance process, far more so, I would say, buttoned up in those processes, and to your point, maybe you're not there to be the CEO's best friend, because in some cases, the CEO isn't even controlling the final say on who's in the boardroom. I've been on international boards. I was on the board at Ericsson where that decision was controlled by the chairman. And there was a very specific kind of set of expertise they were looking for, and they constructed the composition of the board that way. So in some ways, I think international boards are somewhat more deliberate, certainly in Europe, about these areas. And for you, that was an opportunity. It sounds like that gave you your entry point. And I think we often don't think of international boards as an opportunity, but I think European boards definitely maybe have more room. They have, an opportunity for this. And in some ways, I take your point that American boards can be both more informal, more intimate, and also, quite frankly, the CEO is often the chair, and maybe that has pros and cons to it.
Yeah, and look, I think there's a lot of things in what you've just said. I think one of the important pieces worth thinking about, and why I was partly drawn to European boards initially, is that they are much more sort of cheek by jowl with the international sort of global setting. The United States is a sort of beast unto itself, and so even though I can list numerous companies whose top line revenue is over 50% coming from the rest of the world. But as long as they're trading in the S&P 500 or NASDAQ, they still see themselves very much as American. And look at their boards. I mean, their boards by and large are even with they have 40% of the revenue coming from China, they still don't have a Chinese person on their boards. And so I think there's a lot of cultural sort of growth that needs to happen in the boardroom, just in terms of really reflecting what their portfolios say they are in terms of their global imprimatur. But for me, being on the board of Barclays Bank, for example, was really important. They'd been in Africa for 100 years, but they'd been in the emerging markets for 200 years. The company's over 360 years old. They wanted people who had that international perspective. They have a massive footprint in the United States as well, and there were Americans on the board with me. But the point just being that there wasn't sort of a strange transition to have somebody not from Europe on their boards. And I think that there's much more openness to that in Europe than perhaps in the United States, where it's still very dominated by Americans.
Yeah, and by a worldview that maybe values global, yet less than maybe other functions. And this dovetails nicely into the first question from Jenny in our community, who says, for those of us who aren't in the C-suite, what are the areas of experience or expertise that are emerging as the most sought after? So Dambisa, why don't you tell me what you see from the boards you're on, and then I'm happy to contribute to this question, what we see at the board list.
That's great, actually. So in the book, I talk about three particular areas. I'd say 3.5, really. One is geopolitics. Absolutely. I write extensively about the fact that, we very easily as human beings, we love to settle into our status quo worldview. And we, for the last 30 to 50 years, have basically lived in a world of globalization and trade and movement of capital, movement of people, the ability to hire across borders, global standards, World Trade Organization, et cetera, and of course, global cooperation. All of those are facing really aggressive diminution and breakdown. And I won't go into the details, but the fundamental point is the question I always ask, and I think people who are au fait with what's going on geopolitically should be asking is, wait a second, are our business models, are the companies that we run, do they have that veracity to survive a world that becomes much more siloed? And I think so. Geopolitics, understanding what the implications of the splinternet are, this threat that we could have a Chinese-led and a US-led technology, intellectual platforms. How do we think about ability to raise capital in London and New York at low interest rates and invest internationally? What if that breaks down? So that's the carry trade. So there are a lot of those issues, and I think that we need that more and more. Another area, obviously, is technology, and this is a hard one. I actually wrote an article in Harvard Business Review. By the way, if I mention articles or things that I've been reading or I've written, and you're interested, please let Sukhinder or Shannon know, and I'm happy to share that. A lot of it's on my website, but I can get that to you. But in that article, I said it's not that obvious. And Sukhinder, you'll know, you grew up in technology, but we all got into a sort of a tiz about how critical technology was, not just to keep operations and the lights on, but really in terms of competitiveness. How does this make me a better competitor? But obviously risk to the downside as well around, how should I be thinking about cyber? And, there was a big wave of, oh, we need a tech person. here. I think that there were questions about obsolescence of skills and, also the relevance of skills. I think one of the things somebody said to me was that a lot of technology people found it boring being in a heavy regulated, sort of technology 300-year company when they could be in something super exciting. So I think there might have been a sort of cultural misfit, but I think more and more as the technology companies become more mature, I think there will be cross-fertilization, as we've seen. We've seen a lot of regulatory types. Mark Carney just joined Stripe. You've had Roger Ferguson, I think from TIAA. I think he's on Facebook or Google Alphabet. But in any case, the point just being, you get these people who've got a good big regulatory lens moving into technology and vice versa. But I think technology, we know technology is here to stay. What does that mean? As I said, in all those areas, our operations, our opportunities, our risk. How do we think about that? There's potentially real importance, especially for businesses that are really live or die by technology. The last area is clearly around areas of ESG. And listen, I think people's understanding on ESG, it needs some sharpening, including board members ourselves. But I think it's not just about showing up and saying, hey, I'm a woman and I think therefore I should be considered. And I know that may sound sort of flippant on this call, but I'll tell you, I've interviewed very, very eminent and really impressive candidates on paper. And when I say to them, why are you here? Why are you interviewing for this board seat? They would say, well, I heard that you're looking for a woman on the board. I'm like, oh my God, this is like the least interesting thing about you. You've been running a risk department, and so, never say that. Please, God, never say that. It's like, you're better than that. Really, and by the way, it goes by both ways. I've been approached, and when I said, well, why have you approached me about being on this board? People said, well, we're looking for a woman. I'm like, let me stop you right there. I'm the wrong person. I'm like, I did not spend 20 years, 10 years at Goldman plus whatever, learning, writing books and doing all this stuff for somebody to say, I'm going to put you on the board just to, for window dressing. So we should, I think it's happening already. I already told you, Indra Nui is a great example of this, that the competition is there. It's about talent. There's a job to be done in the boardroom. We have to sign off. I'm on the audit committee. I always end up on audit committees or risk. But we have to sign off every quarter. There's a skill that is required there. And as far as I'm concerned, those are the three. And then my little half is smarts. Just real. So people who are engaged in the world, who are continuous learners, those people will always, I think, thrive and succeed because they're constantly pushing the boundaries, especially for large corporations. They've got millions of people, challenging and really probing, going beyond what they're told. I think is really an important area, and unfortunately things like judgment aren't. I can't tell you go and take this class about judgment, but it's really it's an underweighted skill. I think we really love people who show interest in the world, what's happening, what's going on.
Well, I'm going to add a couple of thoughts to what you said for Jenny, and then we'll move on to some other questions. And then I'm going to double click on one. Because the board list sees a good amount of private boards, one of the things I would say to complement Dambisa's point of view is on private boards, certainly, the double click on technology or anything else is one level below. It's not enough to be a technologist. They are still looking ultimately for, to your point, I would say if we were to look at tags that people might look for on the board list platform, they might look like functional, CMO, the brand marketing, performance marketing, not just risk, but cybersecurity, AI. So when you get to these smaller boards, interestingly, they have less. They need even more specialization at certain times in their journey, yet at the same time, they have less seats available. So there's this dichotomy, which is they need specialization, yet they still need, in some ways, to your point, the Swiss Army knife, because they don't have as many independent seats available. So they can't maybe be quite as specialized, but they still are searching for specialization within technology, because of course, they're on a journey where one aspect of technology is super important to unlock for their business, right? So if you're an omni-channel marketer, it may be that digital marketing is far more relevant than a CTO, or the converse might be true, right? Depending on your challenges. So I would say—
add to that, sorry, Sukhinder,
yes.
But can I just add to that? In the book, I call that what we call a T board member. You're deep in one area, but you're broad enough to understand and really be able to contribute more generally. I think a lot of people fall afoul because they know their area super well. They are tip of the spear in a particular area, legal, mind, auditing, or whatever. And then they're in the boardroom and it's like, okay, we're going to move off of technology discussion to talk about, you know, the future of oil or something. And then they're like, well, I guess that's it. I don't have anything else to contribute. Not going to work. So,
well, I think, first of all, I think the image of a T is fantastic because that is a great way. Like you have to be able to contribute horizontally and know your stuff deeply. And I think that's where your judgment comes along. And then the last point you made, which is this idea of continuous learner. You say continuous learner. And when people ask me, I say to folks, you need to be current. Okay, so current doesn't mean necessarily, let's say you're sitting on 5 boards as a professional board member, that you need to be in a sitting operating role. But current needs to mean you are current on issues. Your perspective is current. By virtue of the fact that you sit on 5 boards, you see a range of issues that maybe somebody who's an operator doesn't see, or the converse is true. You may be an operator, I'm making it up, deep in digital marketing, but you are current, let's say, on all things about e-commerce. You are current about, right? So currency matters. Like, and as you said, you either a continuous learner, which is everywhere you go, you are extracting observations that you're convincing a current board that you can apply. You can take something from the world and apply it to make them better. Or you are current, meaning you know, in your own domain, you see broadly, not just narrowly, what's going on. And I think that is, currency is everything, I think.
Hugely so. And I can't emphasize it enough because, you know, I was just saying to someone yesterday, 6 months ago, I had no idea that voting rights, for example, were going to be an issue in the boardroom.
Yeah.
And as I sit here, live and breathe in May, I have no idea in 6 months what the issue will be that I can't anticipate. So whatever I do as an individual board member, but also the strictures and structures around the boardroom, it has to be flexible enough, transparent and consistent and sustainable and all that good stuff, but also flexible enough to accommodate this sort of ebbing and flowing of society. And the only way you can be that is somebody who I think is a continuous learner, who's genuinely interested in the world that we live in. And maybe I'll just say, again, one really quick thing here, which is, and you touched on it earlier about how I picked the boards that I wanted to be on, et cetera. And I think we do a lot of, and I understand this, I was 39 when I joined my first board. I was so excited that maybe I sort of landed in a great board accidentally, as opposed to by design. And in retrospect, I'm thinking, gosh, I was super lucky, but you don't want to end up on a board that you really hate what they produce. Like you really couldn't care less. You're like, I do not care about this widget. Because you really, the best, I think board members should be thinking about a 10-year tenure. Then that's kind of what a good board member should expect. I mean, obviously things happen. I mean, I was on the board of SAB Miller for 8.5 years. We got bought, c'est la vie. But I think that, you know, as you think about your board career, don't just rush for the first board that comes to you, because it will hurt you if you're like, I just cannot spend another minute in this boardroom. This is so boring to me. And you get off after 2 or 3 years, and it's not fatal, but I just think it doesn't look good. It just doesn't show that you are willing to sort of stick it out over time. And so just doing that extra due diligence and saying, hey, wait a minute, I really am not interested in these 5 sectors. I'm definitely interested in these 5 sectors, and making a concerted run for it. I think it pays off a bigger dividend over the long term.
Well, I'm going to go to an audience question in just a second, but there's one thing that I would observe is quite different between public and private boards. Often on private boards, the earlier you go, the more flexibility you have, and the more, in some ways, I would say that is one place where if you, let's say you want to try a board for 3 years, it's very doable because the founder might appreciate that flexibility. Whereas I think in a public board setting, that looks a lot like immaturity, lack of loyalty, desire to churn when, you know, so I think that people should think about, I think, board tenure on this spectrum from in an early stage company, a company may be quite happy. And in some ways, the founder might be like, I don't know what my business is in 3 years. I am delighted that you would be willing to serve as little as 2 to 3 years, absolutely, which is very different. And then by the time you get public, I think your point is so valid, which is choose wisely and, you know, and be prepared that it's at a minimum 5 years and in many cases 10. And I think even there, the spectrum is whatever the board's perspective is. Some boards really hate the idea of people churning at 10 and others are quite happy with a 5-year term. But if you can't go in with a long-term view, it's very difficult on a public board. Absolutely. So I am going to move to Letty, who asked a different question. She said, what would you recommend for a Latina or African-American woman entrepreneur who wants to get into the boardroom? I have 10 years government and nonprofit board and advisory board experience and am involved, but looking to get on a for-profit board. So what do you think, if you are coming from the background specifically of being an entrepreneur, this is another, let's call it non-traditional path. Non-traditional only is defined by the size of your company, not that you are not a CEO or C-suite, but entrepreneur by definition sometimes means a smaller company. What do you think of that path and how do you crack the code?
Well, I think in the world in which we are living, I think it's ever more appealing. I mean, if I may be a little bit maybe challenging, I would say, and I don't mean any disrespect. I mean, most people who know me know my greatest pride is being a Black woman from Africa. I love it. I'm so grateful that that's that's the packaging I come in. But I think that just to that specific question, I would drop the first two bits. To the boardroom, people have goodwill and good intentions. I've not seen people standing behind a dark curtain saying we don't want Blacks, we don't want women. I mean, I know it's inherent and we can have a conversation about that in a lot of structures, but I would just never lead with the point about my race or gender, because the truth of the matter is they know that. It's just not a differentiating fact. I do not think it's a differentiating factor as much as it was maybe 10 or 15 years ago. As I mentioned, now my competition is not some white guy to get onto Amazon. My competition is Indra Nui, who you're like, okay, Indra, but coming to your specific question about entrepreneurship, I think if we think about where the world is going in technology, in entrepreneurship, in China, these are the big themes that we know are going to dominate. And entrepreneurs are, at least small businesses are 85% of the backbone of an economy. We're always looking for that. People who have the ability to work and grind through very challenged positions. I mean, that's what entrepreneurs do on a regular basis. And they're building something that doesn't exist. How do you scale? How do you think about controls? How do you think about risk taking? There are a lot of elements of that role. And I think that those are the areas I would lead with. Again, just to emphasize something I said earlier, think about the committees. Don't think about the board, the big glitzy eights, the board. Forget about that. The committee. What committee are you going to add value in? As an entrepreneur, you can do all of those. I'm sure you have to decide compensation. You have to figure out how you're going to raise money, how you're going to spend it. All those areas matter. Governance, the culture that you want to build, etc. But you should really be thinking long and hard. Wait a second, I really live and breathe risk. I really want to be on the risk committee, or I live and breathe audit. I love accounting so much and controls. That's where I want to spend my time. So for an entrepreneur, I think that you have to do a little bit more of that work. Because you could be all things to all people in many respects. But I think you honing in on that story and saying, hey, I think I could be really good on compensation. And here are a range of issues from minimum wage to pay ratios for CEOs, et cetera, that I've had to deal with. And I think it translates to every level, every type of board. I think is very appealing.
Yeah, and I think a couple of other things to hit on your entrepreneurship comment. Number one, the good news is almost every board is that's large is looking for its innovation gene. That's absolutely true. And when entrepreneurs get tapped, it's because they're getting tapped for the innovation gene, the process of innovation, and the culture of innovation, right? So I know boards, and maybe you do as well, Dambisa. I've been on at least a couple of boards, public boards, which chose to have an innovation committee because this is an issue. And I think the other issues we talked about is culture change. So, but I think I want to go back to your tea example. Let's say you're an entrepreneur and you are deep on innovation. I think if I am a CEO interviewing an entrepreneur for a board, and I've been on both sides of that equation, obviously, I've been an entrepreneur who joined a big board, and I've been on big boards interviewing entrepreneurial candidates. I think the top of the tea is quite important, because let's say you are in a microcosm and your revenues aren't big, that's okay. But I think a CEO and a board member still expect you to have the gravitas and the ability to take your knowledge and think about how it might apply to multiple parts of a bigger organization. So I think you have to be able to translate your entrepreneurial experience, right, your depth experience, into why is this broadly applicable no matter what size you are. And quite frankly, if I'm thinking about how to scale, oh, sorry, gosh, I don't know what's going on here with my my connection. So let's hope it comes back here pretty quickly. Hello? Yep, I'm still here. Can you, oh, let's hope this comes back. There we
Yeah,
go.
they're back.
I know every couple minutes I'm freezing. I think the top of your T, as I was just making the point, is the thing for entrepreneurs to think about, because it will be very easy to talk about innovation. It's about the applicability of your learnings as an entrepreneur that can be relevant at an at-scale company. Does that make sense? So think about the top of the T. How would you translate your deep learnings as an entrepreneur into the top of a T for an organization that's bigger?
And there are lots. And it's honestly the JFK statement, ask not what the board is going to do for you, but what you can do for the board. So, and that's what the CEO is thinking. Wait a second. So this person wants to be on the board. I'm looking, I'm desperate. I've got very little time. What are they going to do for the company, going forward?
Got it. Well, thank you for, that was a pretty fun question. So I see more questions, believe it or not, in chat. So Dambisa, if you're okay with it, I'm going to just keep going to our audience. Somebody said, I'm going to go to this question first. What was the first thing that has surprised you about being a board member? What was the thing you weren't prepared for when you entered your boardroom for the first time, which is dovetails with one of my questions. And you were like, wow, I didn't expect that. Well, how would you answer that question?
I didn't expect, and maybe this is going back to the point about being an entrepreneur as well, because I think entrepreneurs would think this is probably a dumb answer, but I didn't expect that for the vast majority of issues that we contend with, there's no answer. There's no box that says, oh, okay, here's the answer. And it's so important. And I didn't really go through some of the things I've gone through in the past 10 years. I've had a chairman die in office. I've had a company acquired for $100 billion that we were certain nobody was going to buy the company. No way. We were number 2 in the industry. No way. And the number 1 person took out the biggest bond ever in history, acquired us for $100 billion. We were stunned. There are lots of things. There's activists in the stock. You're like, nah, nobody's going to come into the stock. They come into the stock. They're willing to go, go short. They're willing to go to the repo markets. I mean, so stuff is going to happen. Expropriation. You think, wait a minute, we're 21st century. No way is a government going to be so obnoxious as to just take over our assets. It happened to me. And in my book, I have a whole list of, literally just listed out the things that have happened. I had 4 CEOs in 6 years of being on a board. Like, what the heck were you doing, kind of thing. But so it's these corner solutions. And I think very often people think, oh, well, there's a right or wrong answer. And in ESG in particular, climate change, worker advocacy, racial diversity, gender diversity, issues of data privacy, issues of obesity, gun control. We have innate views and we think that our answer is right. But let me tell you, when you walk into a boardroom, you've got to leave your ideology at the door. Because these are companies that, Barclays Bank, as I said, has been around for 360 years. In that respect, I'm just a speck on a custodial role today. And I think, gosh, please don't go under on my watch. I don't want to be the board members where, oh, they were there when this thing went under. But they're complex issues and you have to go and understand that that's what they are. They don't have an answer. There are a lot of trade-offs, a lot of nuance. And I have to say the quote, I put it in the book, but President Obama's quote, which is when he was president, by the time something hit his mailbox, it meant it was extremely difficult, because if it were easy, somebody else would have solved it. It's the same with the boardroom. If the board is involved, it's extremely difficult. There's no yes or no tick box, it's correct. It's not like that. And therefore, if somebody else was going to, somebody else would have solved it if it were easy. By the time it gets to the boardroom, it's very difficult. It requires judgment and nuance, and you can't get it right all the time. So that's the biggest surprise for me.
Thank you. It's a fun answer. The questions keep coming, so we're going to keep going.
Right.
I love conversations. No, it's great. It's fantastic. I love conversations where I never get through my own list. That's always a good sign of a conversation. So there are 2 other questions I want to get to, and maybe we can take this one quickly, and then I'd like you to spend a little more time on the second one. The first question is, where do you get formal training for a board? And I think, where do you find open opportunities? I'm sure you can give us a quick answer there. And then there's, I think, a fun one. And a deep one, fast forward, you are now stepping into the boardroom. What advice would you give to that person who's new and a freshly minted board member walking into their first for-profit board? So first of all, let's start with, where would you get formal training? Do you think formal training is necessary? And where do you find open board opportunities?
Well, open board opportunities, I'm going to say Boardlist, of course.
Of course. But the reality is you have to tell everyone. That is
okay,
true.
all right.
But thank you. But thank you. It's true the Boardlist has a ton, but it's also true that we live in a very fragmented world.
It is your network. You know, if you look there, I know this sounds kind of obsessive and weird, but you know, there have been times where I'm like, gosh, I'm really interested in being on that board. And yeah, you look and see who's coming off of the board, who's terming out. You see, you apply to National Association of Corporate Directors. You see that there's this sort of flow. People are joining boards and leaving. Hey, maybe this is an opportunity for me to reach out, or you know, maybe I know somebody on the board. I can just express my interest today. Look, no doesn't mean never. It just means not now. They could say to you, really not looking right now, but hey, come back in another 5 years, or we'll reach out to you. There are lots of those, what I'd call network effects, if I can call them that, where you just have to stay in the game. You know, you have to be part of the conversation and doing stuff where the sort of watering holes where boards are. More formally, there are lots of places that have formal classes. And I was always shocked when I first joined my early boards. I would get applications from a lot of men wanting to join boards, and I would look and I would see, oh, you know, did a non-executive director training from the Financial Times. They have a sort of a director program, or they did it from PwC or one of the big accounting houses. And sometimes you have to pay a little bit of money, and it's a summer class, etc. But I mean, the programs exist on how to become a better board member, and I think it's good training. There's nothing more I love when I'm interviewing somebody who comes in and says, hey, by the way, I don't you know, I haven't got full on, you know, training, but here's what I've done, you know, in the past to try and beef up my experience. I've taken this class and this is what I learned, etc. So there is formal training out there. Open opportunities. I think we talked about network effects. Obviously, headhunters, they have their utility. This is the traditional search firms. I think they more and more, certainly in Europe, there's a sense that they're trying to create a more fair playing field. So they're trying to encourage boards to actually use search firms more formally, so that they can avoid, hey, I know John on the board and he called me and I'm his mate. So to get rid of that, they're saying, well, you have to only go through these more formal ways. So having a sort of leg in with the headhunters, I don't think is ever a bad idea. The one thing I will say about headhunters, honestly, none of the boards I've ever served on has come through a headhunter, a search firm. I know that seems particularly bizarre, but none of them. And it's because I didn't come from the C-suite. So they have their own, you know, sort of straitjackets and how they think about things. But you know, it's one of those oddities that, you know, people say, oh, well, you're a Black woman. You know, everybody will want you on your board. No, that's not how it works. I can't even get past the headhunters, even with the experience that I've had. Fast forward to give advice, new advice to a new board member. It's a great question, because I was always told, do not say anything the first day. And again, for people who know me, there's no way I could do that. I had to say something. So I think it's your first. So here are a couple of points. Number one, every board that I've joined, and most of the larger boards, they have onboarding, where they basically you meet a lot of people in a relatively short period of time. The CFO, who's responsible for the financial, you meet the person who's in charge of business unit X, etc. You meet the head of HR, all these different, you know, functional units, etc. You know, I would try and postpone that as much as possible. I'm not saying postpone it 5 years in, but say, hey, listen, let me attend 2 board meetings before I get into trying to understand what this business is. Because I think a lot of people, myself included, you appear and you're seeing all these people, Joan, Susan, Bill, you know, and you're like, I have no idea how these people fit into the organization. Even if you have an org chart, it's just too complicated. You need it to come to life. So I have really been pushed. I've pushed back, and boards and companies are very open to that. If you say, I really need to do my board onboarding, but I don't want to do it first, I want to do it after 2 board meetings, it's worked brilliantly. The other things is read the annual reports, for crying out loud. I'm always like, you show up for a board meeting, you haven't even read the annual report. Like, seriously, read the analyst reports. A lot of times you can download them very easily. You should know what the PE ratio of the company is. You should know, what the big issues the company is dealing with are. It's public information. I think it's really important for you to show up in the boardroom with that knowledge. There will obviously be details you won't be privy to, but it's really important to show that, hey, actually, I get it. I understand. Fundamentally, I understand what business this company is in. I understand how it makes money. How does an oil company make money? Okay, they're pulling out a barrel of oil out of the water. It has to, all that effort of exploration and has to be lower than the cost at the pump. I know it sounds basic, but I'm just saying, like, a lot of people breeze over these things. If you're on a beer company and they're making a cerveza in Mexico, how is it possible that it's $5 in a restaurant in New York? Wait a minute, what percentage is going to an employee? What percentage is going to water, CO2 intensity? How do they transport this good from Mexico across the border for $5 in New York? Working through those business model questions is really important, because I can't tell you how many people show up, interviews as well as in the boardroom, and they're like, literally have no clue what business the company is in. So those are things that I think are really important. And you really you have only one shot to make a good impression the first time. And so I think it's good to be seen to be at least understand these basic principles.
Well, to recap before we go to the next question, I think two things you said that really resonated with me. Number one, we used to do this actually when I was running my business at Google. We found that trying to train people when they were coming right into a new job was the absolute worst time to give them onboarding, because they actually wanted to go to whatever region they were working in, be there for a couple of weeks, and then we would send them to onboarding because they had a lot more context. So I do think that point about maybe you don't have to do the onboarding right away, but you can ask to do it after your first or second board meeting is one. Number two is, sometimes the questions we're too shy to ask in the boardroom about the things we don't understand about the company. I think you will find that absent onboarding, you can easily email the CFO and just say, I have a question. I don't understand this about our business model, so that you can get those questions answered. Let's say you have all these questions about, you read the annual report, you don't understand something. I don't think you should be shy to ask one-on-one the members of the management team you undoubtedly met in the interview process, because you probably meet at least the CFO. I've always found the CFO and the general counsel of the company very willing to help me as a board member not look stupid and understand, something that I just don't get. So often I don't ask that question in the boardroom. I just email them like, I really don't understand this. Can you just explain to me what's going on and why these numbers don't foot? And they're very gracious in helping you get on.
So critical. And I like that you mentioned the GC as well as the CFO. The other person who's an unsung hero to me is the company secretary. They know where all the bodies are buried. If you call and say, hey, I have no idea what a barrel of oil costs, or what the N95 masks are with 3M or whatever, if they can't answer it, they know the person who can answer it. But it's a really great point, because I'm probably a bit more conservative than others on this issue, because a lot of people don't have any problem saying, I'm just going to call the CEO. I feel badly calling the CEO. I'm like, my God, the CEO has got all these hundreds of thousands of people. The share price is down, debt's gone up, whatever. I'm like, do I really need to call them and say, hey, by the way, I didn't really understand the definition of this? Probably not. So it's good judgment. I mean, I try to give more to the CEO and CFO than take from them. So I like to say, hey, did you see Warren Buffett's AGM meeting? He made this comment, just FYI. I prefer to do that than to call them and ask them to clarify stuff. I think it shows a lot of good entrepreneurship as a board member to go to the company secretary, to just navigate the organization. You find out a lot more as well that way. But great point, Sukhinder.
Yeah, I think it's super key. Okay, so Jordan's asking, in your experience, do you feel like board selection committees are really adequately built these days to assess skills? And are the selection committees themselves diverse? What do you think?
Yeah, I do. More and more, for sure. I mean, what does diverse mean, in the sense that is there an equilibrium? Obviously, we're not at an equilibrium that matches the sort of diversity of society, but are they diverse? Yes, absolutely. I think that it's true that not all board members are equal. You get on a board, there are 12 seats. There's some board members who are chair.
All right, we're going to sit tight here. I think, Dambisa, you're frozen for us right now, but hopefully you'll come back online. Oh, Shannon, I think we've lost Dambisa. Let's hope she dials back in. Sorry, everyone, sit tight. Looks like Dambisa's having a little bit of trouble with her connection. So if you could just bear with us, I'm sure she'll be back on in a moment. And thanks for all the great comments so far, folks, from people who thinks it's a valuable session. Appreciate hearing that. Hey, Dambisa.
Oh my God, is it me or is it you or somebody?
I think it may be your connection, but we're all good. Everybody here is waiting patiently on bated breath for your next comment.
Sorry.
I think you're enjoying it. No problem. So I think what we were chatting about is, do you believe that selection committees are diverse? And it sounds like the answer is yes. And do you believe they're equipped to assess? And it sounds like you also think the answer is yes to that.
No, I think I should say yes, but meaning that I don't think that's my point. There's not really an equilibrium. I don't think this is something that you're like, oh, that's checked and that's the end of it. These are constantly changing things. I mean, someone said to me recently, one of the boards I'm on, they're like, you realize that we're one board member quitting away from being non-diverse in the sort of, what are your ratios? What are the numbers? And so I think I always think about these type of institutions as being very dynamic. And I think that's a really important piece of how we think about this. There's always something to learn. There's always something we can be better. I just gave you an example. We weren't thinking about voter rights 6 months ago. Now it's like, oh, wait a second. How do we imbue that? And, I was also struck recently by something one of the employees said to me. They said, oh, when it was Black Lives Matter, every company rushed out and made big statements. When it's about Asians being attacked, it was basically crickets. How does the board think about that? And I was like, it's a great point. And I think a lot of that is because, in some of the boards that I'm on, there aren't the Asian voices. So it's not an end point. These things are not end points. They're constantly evolving. And I think I guess when I said yes, my point was that, yes, we are constantly evolving. And I think there's much more of a light shining on all these areas.
Yeah. Well, we have time for just a couple more questions. So apologize, everyone. I'm going to cherry pick so we get to some of the newer ones. Somebody was asking about many directors struggle with the transition from operations to governance. What are your observations or insights or even advice in making that?
Oh my God. I hope the line doesn't get cut on this one. Oh my God. It's like the worst board member is the person who's there every day, who's like micromanaging. It's like awful. It's horrible to see it. I mean, I think I lean on the other extreme where I'm probably far too esoteric and high level. And there are downsides to that as well, because from the CEO and management perspective, they're like, they don't want to be confused. They want clarity, what they need to do next, what's good, what's bad, what needs improvement. Whereas if you start talking about, big macro trends, they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. But at the same time, they do not like it. And I think they're rightly so. When board members are supposed to provide oversight, they're like, oh, actually, can you do a presentation for me on this? It is so irritating, and I think it's fundamentally unproductive. So finding that right balance of how you're providing oversight and governance, but at the same time, not being a micromanager operational, you're not that anymore. You did that, that's why you're on the board, is a very fine balance. And I think the way I think about it is using the tools I just said. I think about, really whittling down the presentations to just one page. What's the so what of what you're telling me? What's working, what's not working? And, for the stuff that's not working, how can we do better? How can we improve it? I think that that's a good 40,000 feet that you would expect from board members. And so avoid doing debits and credits, not a good look for board members. And you end up getting bad reviews at the end of the year anyway, so don't do that.
Well, I think a couple things to add. And again, this is one place where private boards, the CEO may be looking for you to play that role, i.e. go deep on a topic. But I've always found in a boardroom, a good way to do it is to say, hey, I'm really curious about this issue. Is anybody else curious? If so, maybe we can schedule a board meeting around it. If not, I'm happy to take it offline. So one of the ways I try and figure out is like, is this a topic everybody wants to hear about, or am I obsessing about something that's unproductive? You know, again, with my board hat on. I found it useful, and obviously that's very applicable if you're a digital board member in a company, let's say, that's not digital, but you're trying to understand, is something really fundamentally wrong or right? Sometimes the only way to know is to probe, but I think probing in the boardroom is very unproductive. It's more productive to be like, is this a session that's valuable for everyone, or can I just take this offline with you so I can understand it better? Is maybe one way to navigate that issue. And sometimes the CEO will be very explicit when they want you as a board member to dive in on an issue. And so you can say to the CEO, do you want me to dive in with your team on this issue? You know, I think CEOs have the best view of like where a board member can be very operationally helpful without being intrusive.
Yeah.
All right. So guys, we are down to 1 more minute. I'm going to see if we can squeeze in one more question for you, Dambisa, because they've been so many. Let's see. Any suggestion on how to broaden the strategy discussion that happens in the boardroom? And actually, I'm gonna swap that question out. Sorry, there's so many good ones here, but this is the one I want you to end on. One key theme that has come through this conversation is the keyboard skill is the need for good judgment and pragmatism. How is good judgment viewed by a board selection committee without the benefit? Like, so how do you demonstrate, like when you're interviewing somebody for good judgment, is that something you can assess, and how do you assess it? Because we talked about the benefits.
I love that question. I really do, because that's where I think there's a lot of innovation, a lot of work that needs to be done in the boardroom. And just to give you the way I approach it, by the time somebody's being interviewed for a seat in the C-suite by me, I know that they're down packed in their numbers. They're great financial people, great operational people, great on strategy. It's a waste for me to as far as I'm concerned, to continue to ask them questions that they're probably going to have an answer to. So I've been doing a lot of homework on the sorts of questions that you're talking about. How do you gauge judgment? Now, the thing is, remember, there's no right or wrong answer. And you do have to suspend your ideological belief. If you are part of the woke movement, very left-leaning, and you're interviewing somebody who's pretty conservative, but who is really great, you don't want to ding them because of their political values. You want to be able to see whether they would be a good addition to the board. So I'll give you one of the questions that I like to ask. And by the way, I think this is a great question to ask a potential date as well. But it's an open-ended question. So I've started to put together a portfolio of open-ended questions. And I'm actually thinking about maybe putting it out as an addendum to my book, just questions that we should think about. I think it'd be a great
idea, by the way. I know you'd find a lot of people who would be dying to know those questions. So.
But then my candidates would know the questions before I interviewed them. But the question that I think is important is, what's the worst thing you've done to another human being? You know, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. And I've heard some crazy stuff, I'll tell you. But, you know, in a world where ethics matters, and a moral compass, it's just not good enough to rely on references anymore. It's just not, they're not weighty enough. There were over 400 people fired in 18 months because of Me Too. I myself have had to fire a number of CEOs, and I'm going to tell you, over 50% of the reasons I've had to fire or punish or fine a CEO were actually ethical infringements. Not at all to do with, they missed the financial target.
It's like, did this person use good
Correct.
Yeah.
So we need to have those type of conversations. And, you know, and by the way, Sukhinder, I've loved this so much. I've learned so much. If people are interested, I'm willing to come back for another hour or 30 minutes.
Oh my goodness, we would love that. If you'd like to have Dambisa come back, we would gladly have you back.
Yeah, I will come back. I don't want to dominate or whatever, but there's so many interesting questions that I think are important for us to discuss. So if people are interested, we can organize that. Shannon and I will have a chat about that. But the point just being that I think it's really important to think about these questions of ethics and morality, because that CEO position is that person is the standard bearer of the company. They are the face of the company, and really, really important in terms of how we think about the company going forward.
Okay, so that was a gem. We're getting lots of, yes, we want more sessions. So Dambisa, we're going to take you up on
I'll
that
come back
and have you back. I promise we'll give you a bit of a reprieve as you're on your book tour. So we won't try and do it in the next 1 to 2 weeks, but we would love to have you back. And it sounds like there's just a tremendous appetite for hearing what you have to say. So on behalf of everyone at the board list, Shannon and team, thank you for organizing this. It's always fun to be able to have these conversations on our platform. And Dambisa, thank you to you. Thank you for giving us.
Thank you, Shannon. You've been phenomenal. Really appreciate Shannon and the team. And thank you, Sukhinder, for the opportunity, and everyone who asked questions. I'm sorry, couldn't get to them, but thank you. And I look forward to
part 2. All right. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.